In this video, we're going to focus a little more closely on some of the activism of the abolitionist movement. Abolitionist groups such as the American Anti-Slavery Society devoted their time to petitioning legislatures and mobilizing public opinion. In time, however, many abolitionists broadened their activism. They more directly confronted the evils of slavery and in the process angered Southerners and worrying Northerners even more. The abolitionists, for example, played a major role in the Amistad case of 1839. In 1839, the slaves aboard the slave ship Amistad revolted and got control of the ship and tried to steer it back to Africa. The ship was going from one Cuban port to another at the time. The slaves couldn't get back to Africa, however, and thus sailed up north along the Atlantic coast until the Americans seized it in New York. The Amistad case then, sort of raised the issue of the American fugitive slave law. Should New York return the slaves to their owners? Well, the old former President John Quincy Adams argued for the abolitionists that since the slaves had been recently brought to Cuba illegally from Africa, the captors should be set free. Well, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the court agreed with Adams and ordered the slaves freed. The Amistad case got a lot of coverage, and while it thrilled abolitionists, it certainly angered Southerners who feared similar uprisings. In fact, it might have inspired an uprising by 135 slaves in 1841 being sent from Norfolk, Virginia to New Orleans. To fight fugitive slave laws, many Northern abolitionists began to press for what they called personal liberty laws. Abolitionists claimed that their purpose was to prevent the capture of free blacks in the North, who were then transferred to slavery in the South as escaped slaves. This argument was powerful enough to get personal liberty laws passed in a number of northern states. The real purpose was also to slow down and interrupt the enforcement of the fugitive slave laws. The personal liberty laws required a slave catcher to obtain search warrants and stipulated jury trials before runaways could be sent back to the South. The abolitionists, of course, would then try to fight or delay the warrants, or try to stack the jury in the free blacks' favor. Probably the most famous of all the abolitionist actions in the late antebellum age was the Underground Railroad, and it involved abolitionists actually in the South, a sort of a loose network of them who worked together to get runaway slaves to freedom. They took railroad terminology because just then railroads are spreading so fast. Escaped slaves were called passengers, while the network leaders were called conductors, who guided them to safe houses known as stations. It operated mostly in the upper South and border states. It was too dangerous and complicated to work in the middle of the deep South. It was just too far. If a runaway from the deep South wanted to escape, they first had to make it to places like Missouri, Kentucky, or Virginia. It was run more by free blacks, actually, than white abolitionists. Although the whites, if the whites were caught, however, they were seen as traitors and almost always executed or jailed for a long time. The passengers would be led from one conductor to the next, one safe house to the next. Often the conductor only knew the person before and after him and no one else, so that if caught, he wouldn't have to give up he wouldn't give up too much information. The conductor would give food, clothing, and steer the passenger to the next barn, shop, whatever, where the next conductor would find it. The process repeated itself all the way into the North, and frequently even into Canada. It's difficult to estimate the number of blacks who escaped using the Underground Railroad. Records weren't, of course, kept, and owners of slaves used bloodhounds and posted rewards for the passengers' capture, so we have some idea only from that. Some have estimated that the number who escaped was as high as 1,000 per year, but most think the successes were not nearly that high. In any event, the rates would constantly change. Conductors would change because of the need to be secret. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. Born as a slave in Maryland in 1820, She had permanent problems from a blow to her head that her master gave her as a small child. Named Araminta at birth, she took the name Harriet before marrying a free black named John Tubman. When her husband refused to help her to escape, she fled on her own and settled in Pennsylvania to work as part of the Underground Railroad. Nicknamed Moses, she made 11 dangerous trips back into the South as a conductor before moving to Canada in 1852. If she'd been caught, she was an escaped slave and a part of the Underground Railroad, she would have been severely punished. From Canada, she then made it 19 more trips into the South as a conductor, and in total helped over 300 slaves escape. During the Civil War, she served as a spy in the South, and afterwards set up a school for ex-slaves in North Carolina. She ended up helping to create the National Association of Colored Women after the Civil War. Mostly she helped poor old freedmen who were too old or feeble to work. She died at the age of 93 in 1913 in relative obscurity. She only became famous when the civil rights movement of the 1960s sort of began to play off her. With the abolitionists growing and their arguments spreading, of course, Southern slave owners responded in kind, making their arguments more forcefully. And one of the ways they did it was using the Bible and sort of rebutting the abolitionist religious arguments point by point. In the next video, I talk about the way that slavery divided religions and go into more detail about how the Southerners argued for slavery using the Bible. But there were other reasons as well other ways that Southerners defended the institution of slavery against the abolitionists than using just the Bible. Southerners, slave owners would say, for example, that slaves simply weren't ready for independence. They're not equal, and if they were free, they would hurt themselves. They'd be uncontrollable. They couldn't support themselves. And so in that way, slavery was almost protecting them from themselves. And they argued for a long time that slaves were better off than the northern free white laborers. In the North, discussed in earlier videos, the conditions for workers was getting worse and worse. And so, hey, our slaves are taking better care than your northerners were, at least some slave owners would argue. And then, of course, slaves, the Southerners would argue, supported Southern society writ large, which they argued was more refined and better, if you think of chivalry, than the dirty, cheap, anything goes Northern society, the greedy Northern society. We've already talked about in previous videos the idea of Southern hospitality and the Southern way of life is being superior, the slave owners argued. Well, slaves made that possible. With the abolitionists growing increasingly forceful, their advocacy becoming more direct, many whites looked back to something that had been around since the 1700s, the idea of avoiding a war, avoiding the problem by resettling African Americans back to Africa. You see this several times in distant American past, even among black leaders and white leaders like Thomas Jefferson spoke of colonization as a possible solution to the problem of slavery. Anyway, in 1817, that very early in the era of good feelings, a number of wealthy whites created the American Colonization Society to resettle blacks back to Africa. By the antebellum age, it had grown tremendously and had leadership in Congress, including Henry Clay. As a matter of fact, the American Colonization Society successfully got federal and state efforts to help pay some of their costs. Here you can see a membership card of the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society bought land in West Africa and established the colony of Liberia, obviously a play on the word liberty. When the U.S. President James Monroe supported it, Liberia's capital was named Monrovia. Their flag had red, white, and blue, and even today their official language in the country of Liberia is English. In the end, the American Colonization Society moved about 10 to 15,000 African Americans back to Liberia. More than a dozen states contributed funds. While Liberia became an independent African republic in 1847, and the picture here is about that time, the idea of colonizing American slaves back to Africa was doomed for failure from the start. The price of slaves was rising because of the cotton in the Southwest, and thus the American Colonization Society had to pay more to buy the slaves from the plantation owners. Many simply refused to sell. In any event, raising the funds necessary was just impossible. Many in the abolitionist movement also saw the idea of colonization as racist, confirming somehow that blacks were inferior and could not live equally with whites in the same terms. Finally, of course, many American blacks themselves considered themselves Americans, not Africans, and they simply didn't want to go. African Americans had been around in the Western Hemisphere as long as whites had. As the years passed and the question of abolitionism grew more heated, a few slave owners, wishing to diminish tensions if not recognizing their slaves' humanity, manumitted, or set free, their slaves. When manumission took place, it was often in wills and a reward for loyal service over the years. Hoping to decrease tensions, some agreed with the abolitionists that slavery was inherently sinful, but maintained that God would operate on his own time, or that Christ's second coming was so close it was best just to wait. A greater number argued that a compromise might still be crafted, allowing for gradual emancipation nationally, much like some of the northern states had earlier done individually. This was the approach of many followers and the disciples of Christ, a denomination that suggested that war was the only alternative, and God would never condone that. A Christian restoration movement grew, seeking to unite all the Christian denominations under a single theology, a theology that, among other points, rejected slavery. If all the churches condemned slavery, it might have an effect in swaying public opinion and avoiding a potential war. These views, of course, all ignored the growing fervor of the abolitionists and slave owners alike. Here you see a flyer with the leaders of the Christian Restoration Movement. And in a subsequent video, I'll look at how the religion itself was split by the issue of slavery. In any event, this concludes the video on the growing activism of the abolitionist movement and how people reacted to it.